Hello and welcome to News in Depth here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. The Suwałki Gap, NATO's most vulnerable choke point, is once again under the spotlight. Russian and Belarusian forces are preparing for the large-scale Zapad 2025 military drills, sparking concerns about potential aggression along the Polish-Lithuanian border. At the same time, Finland's growing role in NATO is underscored by Polish President Nawrocki's visit to Helsinki, while regional tensions stretch from the Baltics to the Balkans. Joining us to unpack these developments is Stuart Dell, he's political editor of TVP World. Stuart, good to see you. Welcome.
Good to be here.
So let's start with the Suwałki Gap. It's a tiny piece of land. I think we've got a piece of we've got a little map showing where it is, so we can have a look at where the vulnerability may be. So it should be coming up now. There we go. I think it's... OK. So how much of a vulnerability is this? I mean, we see that it's actually in a very... It seems to be in a very strategic position.
Yes, of course. It's a huge vulnerability for Poland, Lithuania, and for NATO in general. The gap stretches from Russia's exclave Kaliningrad, heavily fortified region, which has some of Russia's most dangerous missiles, the Iskander. They have sophisticated air defense systems, and it's 104 kilometers, 65 miles from the Belarusian border. Of course, Belarusian is a captured state for Russia. It's completely under Russia's control, and the Russian army can use it as it pleases.
Well, it did in Russia's invasion in 2022. There was a launch, an attack launched from Belarus, so clearly that's certainly on the cards.
Yes, exactly, and the danger for Poland, Lithuania and NATO is that Russia could launch a kind of pincer movement from both sides and cut off that gap. And the Baltic states is the only land corridor between continental Europe and the Baltic states. So
that would essentially cut off the Baltics?
Yes, that is until recently when Finland and Sweden joined NATO, and that gives a lot of cover from the northern flank.
Yeah, but Finland in itself has a border with Russia of over 1,200 kilometres, so it itself is pretty vulnerable to an attack. So that whole region is really under threat. How important or how relevant do you think these Zapad 2025 exercises are? Is this simply more saber-rattling, or is it something that is a real threat?
Well, Russia uses Zapad exercises for three purposes: to battle test, to test its own forces' readiness, to nuclear signal, because it has its own nuclear weapons stationed in Belarus now, and also the exercises. A component of the exercises are the use of their Oreshnik missile, which is nuclear capable, and it's sending a message to Poland and NATO that it has these weapons, and it also provides cover for, I think, what Poland and its NATO allies are really concerned about this time is the possibility of hybrid operations against Lithuania or NATO, using the Zapad exercises as a cover.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned hybrid, because we've actually got we've got a soundbite from Philip Ingram. He's a former Secret Service analyst. I think we've got that coming up in just a second.
A former British intelligence officer has described the Suwałki Gap on the Poland's northeastern border as NATO's Achilles heel. Alliance troops regularly hold drills to defend the 104-kilometer-long narrow strip of land. The gap separates Poland and Lithuania and is sandwiched between Russia's enclave of Kaliningrad and Moscow's ally Belarus. Philip Ingram who worked in military intelligence, told Britain's Sun newspaper that it could be particularly vulnerable to an attack by Moscow's forces. The security consultant highlighted how observers had noted a build-up of Russian troops in both Kaliningrad and Belarus. Ingram told the paper that taking control of the Suwałki corridor could potentially isolate the Baltic states from their NATO partners.
Right, so what Philip Ingram was saying there is exactly aligned with what you've just said. Now, compare that to what Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies, is saying. And he's saying, well, actually, it's much more likely that this is going to be a hybrid attack on NATO, on Poland and on the Baltic states than a kinetic one. This is simply a bit of making noise, a bit of distraction, a bit of cover, as you say, for those attacks. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think he's right. We have to remember that in 2021, Western military observers could see very clearly the forces that Russia was drawing into Belarus, and those forces became part of the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. We haven't seen that build-up this time. We don't know exactly how many troops will be involved in Zapad, but certainly not anywhere near the level of 2022, simply because a lot of those soldiers are dead. From the Ukraine war or involved in the fighting now.
Well, there's a report which says, where Belarusian President Lukashenko says it's down to 13,000 in Zapad 2025 compared to 200,000 last year. So, but the way he couches it is quite interesting. He says it's an indication of how peace-loving we are, that we're having a much smaller number of soldiers involved. I'd like to move on now to Finland, frontline state, border with Russia, and it's received a visit from President Nawrocki. And what's interesting or noteworthy, perhaps, and I'd like your view on this, is that the president went to Washington to meet President Trump, and then came to the Baltic region, and he's now in Finland, rather than going to Brussels or Germany or any other EU country. What is the message that is giving you, if any?
Well, obviously the message of not visiting Brussels and not visiting Germany is a message in line with President Nawrocki's Euroscepticism. But particularly why he's visiting, and also remember that before his trip to Washington, he held a mini summit with leaders of what they call the Nordic-Baltic dimension, the Baltic 3 and the Nordic 5. People talk of a Polish pivot towards the Baltic, away from, for example, Visegrad states. President Nawrocki will be visiting Orban and from Hungary and Fico from Slovakia. So he's not ignoring the southern Visegrad states. But why the Baltics? Because of the threats coming from Kaliningrad, the northern flank is very important now. Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, signalled that he expects that Russia could attack NATO along the Baltic border by 2031. So everyone's attention is there.
Right. Well, we've got a soundbite from President Nawrocki. Let's just have a listen to that, and I'll get your view on that.
Today we spoke primarily about security. History shows that both the Finns and the Poles know the Russian soul firsthand. We believe that Putin is ready to attack other countries, which is why we work towards strengthening our cooperation. We're glad to be able to count on Finland when it comes to the security architecture in the region.
All right, so fairly clear there. He says we understand the Russian mentality in these matters, and therefore, we need to strengthen. Are we strong enough in the region to hold back, in your opinion, a full-scale Russian kinetic attack?
Well, analysts talk of the idea of states in the region being porcupines. They're impossible to swallow.
A bit like Singapore.
Yes, yes. And there's some justification for thinking that's true. The Baltics are strengthening their borders to try to create an area of deniability, military deniability to the Russians, rather than previously the Baltics were more of a tripwire that we would see them coming early enough. And they're also increasing their troop numbers, and then the joining of Finland and Sweden of NATO a couple of years ago changes the dynamics completely. Instead of Kaliningrad being a very threatening entity in that region, it's now looking rather like it's surrounded on all sides. Baltic has become a NATO lake. Finland famously has its philosophy of total defence. It can field, they say, about 280,000 soldiers. It has 900,000 reservists, which is an incredible number for a country with a population of around 6 million. It also has a modern air force of F-35s, I believe. And then Sweden is a country with a submarine force, also with very sophisticated air defence and its own homemade aircraft. So that really changes the dynamics. And obviously, President Nawrocki wants to make sure that cooperation is going very well with those countries.
Right. So the Nordics, Baltics, difficult to swallow, and actually they're probably tougher than perhaps many would expect. But what about this? You mentioned the reserves that Finland has, 900,000, and they were in play actually in the Winter War, just around the Second World War, where they stopped a huge Russian invasion, and they were quite a surprise. Is that the kind of model, perhaps, that the smaller countries within NATO and the EU should consider adopting?
Well, in terms of increasing troop numbers, possibly. What's very interesting is that you can look at Finland in two ways. There's its total defence doctrine, which is a good model for countries on Europe's eastern flank that feel threatened by NATO. But it's also interesting why Finland has become such an important player with America, and particularly with Donald Trump. We know about the good relationship that Trump has with President Stubb. But it's not that good news for Ukraine and Europe. Trump likes the history of Finland because for him it represents a country that gave up some of its territory, agreed to have its military neutered, and not join NATO, and not really fall out of line in that way. And he's presenting that as a model for Ukraine. So he's using the Finnish example almost as a kind of historical precedent for what some people say would be the betrayal of Ukraine in the peace negotiations.
Right. Well, you mentioned Ukraine, and President Zelensky has come out, wholeheartedly in support of strengthening the Baltic region against Russia and Belarus. What are the implications for Ukraine should there be some kind of invasion in that region?
It would be a huge escalation, and it's. On one hand, you could see that as a plus for Ukraine. It would draw troops away from Donbass, troops that Russia can ill afford. But I don't think that's likely. As you said, the idea of a kinetic something kinetic happening in the region is very, very unlikely. There are different scenarios. There's the hybrid scenario that we talked about. And then there are kind of sabotage scenarios that we saw several years ago. Estonian border guard was kidnapped from his post on his own side. Then there's the kind of activities exploiting the Russian-speaking population in some of those countries as well.
Yeah, that actually raises the question of NATO's Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. We just mentioned two, if you like, families or groups of attacks against NATO countries by Russia and Belarus. When, in your opinion, should Article 5 be triggered? I mean, you know, going onto NATO soil and kidnapping a border guard, is that an act of war? Some would say yes. Should that trigger Article 5? What about, you know, cyber warfare? Should that trigger Article? Or do we have to wait until the bullets start flying before, you know, countries in NATO start thinking about responding?
Well, it's a good question. The kidnapping of the Estonian border guard didn't trigger Article 5, as we know. The burning down of different factories and ammunition plants in Central Europe hasn't triggered Article 5. So, of course, it has to be something much greater. And we have to remember as well that...
Where's the line?
Yes, exactly. And triggering Article 5 in itself doesn't automatically mean war. It just means that countries regard it as an attack on themselves collectively, and then they will meet and consider their response, which doesn't automatically mean a full-scale war. Depending on what the provocation is from Russia, the response would probably or possibly be something commensurate or proportionate.
Yeah, whatever that may mean. I mean, getting some kind of consensus on what is proportionate might take its own sweet time as well. I mean, that's the other thing. And of course, Article 5 doesn't automatically say that there has to be a response. Countries are given some flexibility as to what response they actually make. So, yeah, so let's hope it doesn't come to that. I'd like to go to Serbia now. And Serbia is experiencing internal unrest at the moment. We see the protests going on, but nothing seems to be happening. I know you've been looking at this. Your thoughts on the situation right now?
Well, we're into the 10th month of the protests. The protests over the summer have intensified. They've become violent. Bullets have been fired, albeit in the air, but live rounds have been fired. That's a very dangerous precedent. There's no sign that the protests will abate. People are questioning how long the Alexander Vucic's, the president's regime, can last. I actually see it quite differently. I think that Vucic has designed a system to withstand this kind of pressure. He's been president for a long time. He's neutered the media. He's captured the media. The independent media that exists, for example, television, only reach the large cities. He's captured the political electoral process. The opposition is ineffective and fragmented. His support is propped up by an extensive system of patronage and clientelism. People's livelihoods depend on supporting Vucic. When it comes to elections, he's got all the techniques down pat. He busses voters in from one place to the other. He uses state funds for his own campaigning. There are incidents on election day in polling stations. And also the opposition. Let's talk about the student opposition. It's very difficult for them to organise because they don't want to put their own candidates up for the next election, parliamentary election. And they don't trust the fragmented opposition parties. They have problems with them and
they don't
corruption.
trust the vote count either.
As well, yeah. It's suggested in polling that should the students, protesting students, stand at election, if they put their lists together, they could poll anywhere around 45 to 55%. They would certainly win a fair election. But they've said that they don't wish to stand themselves. However, they might put together lists of respected members of the community,
right.
Senior lawyers, doctors, people in the professions. But for the reasons that I just gave, it's unlikely that they would be able to gain a majority in the parliament.
Or to even force an election, from the sounds of it.
Yeah, and President Vučić is in his second term. According to the Serbian constitution, can only run for 2 terms.
Yeah.
That's going to come up. It's going to end in
Unfortunately, Stuart, we're going to have to end it there. But yeah, sorry about that. But, you know, the clock's beaten us. Thank you very much for coming along and sharing your analysis, Stuart. And that brings us to the end of this episode of News in Depth. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.